Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. We have Nicole Karlis. Nicole's a health and science journalist. Her work has been published in Salon, the New York Times, Marie Claire, and the Bold Italic. And her new book, available now, is called Your Brain on Altruism: The Power of Connection and Community During Times of Crisis. Nicole, it's a pleasure to have you here, and thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to talk about my book and talk to you both.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
And so in her book, Nicole wrote, my research led me to ask some fundamental questions. What if modern day self care, which is intended to prolong our survival, has become yet another form of individualism that harms us? Why is volunteering one's time so difficult for so many?
Mhm.
What if acts of kindness are the antidote to the loneliness crisis? And if the answers are what I suspect they are, then how can it be so hard to maintain the state of altruism we experience amid catastrophe? Throughout my reporting, I was haunted by the same questions repeating over and over again in my head. If we know helping others is good for us and can be truly profound or can have truly profound effects on our individual and societal health, why can it feel so hard to be so kind? Why is there burnout among caregivers in the United States? Why is kindness something that feels easier to embrace in the wake of a crisis and not in more quote unquote normal times?
Mhm.
Again and again, researchers told me we live in a culture that's built on fear. And in order to prioritize caring for others, the systems have been built on scarcity, need to be burned to the ground. But I didn't want my book to end with an abstract answer that felt too big a task to undertake, or one that was sprinkled with a bit of hopelessness. I wondered, could a change come more organically and not require a crisis?
Mm.
So, fundamental question. I love it. And I love where it seems like, obviously, now based on this, where the book is going. So, actually, can we just get into some of the basics first? So, what is
Yeah.
altruism and how does it contrast with the way we normally think of American culture?
Right. So altruism is when you do something to benefit another person's welfare, with the intention of improving their life, making them happy, not something that's motivated to necessarily help yourself. And obviously, we live in a culture that's like I said in my book, that's really driven by profit, that's really driven by fear, that's driven by scarcity. As a culture, we don't offer a lot of, free services just for the sake of offering it to improve our society and to improve our culture and to improve the communities that we live in. We very much live in a survival of the fittest society, and a lot of the questions I'm asking in my book, and I explore this in one chapter, is what if we actually thought that it's survival of the kindest.
Mm.
um yeah.
I love that so much. And
Mm.
so I would just want to kind of get a little personal because I actually like the personal parts of your story a lot more, just because I feel like for like the academic stuff, as wonderful as they are, I feel like the stuff that touches people are the personal stories. So what's so interesting is I'm going through your book, the thing that I'm thinking about, which I've mentioned, countless times on the show, is my relationship with my mentor.
Mhm.
So my mentor, so his name was Dr. Tim Stroop. So the thing is for him, unlike what you get for the most part with people who have a background from Harvard or any other Ivy League university, is for the most part, I mean, these people tend to self-promote and they focus on their works, on their books, etc. So what was so interesting about my relationship with him is that he never really wrote much. So he has like a dissertation out somewhere and a couple of publications and anthologies, which are to me really like phenomenal. But the thing is, they're not well known. So what I like is that when you're thinking about altruism, is you're thinking about what does this mean for the actual person in connection to what this means for society as well, right? So where for Tim, like he could have taken an individual route and he could have said to himself, like, well, listen, teaching is kind of more or less a means to an end, but he didn't do that. And so for me, that was particularly life changing because if he didn't invest the time into me and a lot of his other students, I just feel like my life would have been completely different. As I've said before, not to go over this again, but I used to be a conspiracy theorist. I had all sorts of crazy beliefs. And so for the years that I've known him, I mean, he really took the time to actually kind of hone in on it and sort of figure out why I believed what I believed. And it never felt like he had a hidden agenda. So, Nicole, I want to know from your perspective, right? What are some of the personal stories in your life that shaped you in the way that Tim shaped mine and shaped me in my thinking?
My personal stories.
Yeah, of altruism.
Yeah, that's a really good question. No one has asked me that. I mean, I started to, get interested in the science behind altruism because of a personal story that I did have happen to me. And I can, after that, share some other, personal stories. But basically, I was at yoga teacher training in India, I think in 2015. And I was feeling really just personally lost in my life and suffering from a lot of anxiety. And I was often the anxiety manifested by like a lot of rumination in my head, just like not even being aware of what's even physically happening in front of me because I'm so caught up in the same conversations and ruminating and almost like obsessing over these worries in my head.
Mm.
And, I think that's actually what attracted me to yoga a lot, like to kind of focus on getting my body, focus on the breath, focus on slowing down.
Mm.
And one day, my yoga teacher was kind enough to bring me to visit his Vedic astrologer. And he read my birth chart. And honestly, like, I can't even remember what my birth chart said. That's not, like the biggest takeaway from this experience and what I remember 10 years later. But instead, I asked him, like, I am, really struggling with anxiety. Sometimes, like, it feels like my skin is crawling. Like, what can I do? What would you recommend?
Mm.
And, do you have any holistic, remedies? And I thought he would say like more a special meditation or something like that. But instead, he wrote a prescription for acts of kindness. So
Mm.
that is, kind of in the very beginning of my book, but that's where I actually started to like think about how acts of kindness and altruism can actually get you out of your head. And so when I actually did those acts of kindness, I was really focused on how I felt like in the before and after. And I was like, wow, like this is actually bringing so much to my day as well. Like I'm feeling good. I'm actually feeling like a physical shift internally. But is there any science to this? And, that's, also kind of what kicked off the investigation of the book. But I mean, I think too, like as a writer, as an author of like all the teachers who have gone above and beyond to spend extra time with me, fellow, like former coworkers, just, and I mean, anyone when I've been, overwhelmed and it like other moms in my community. I'm a mom of two now, who have been able to like send me a meal when like I can barely like feed my family and my husband and I are overwhelmed, with our kids. So all of those, add up. I think, as someone, when you receive an act of kindness, like you don't forget that. You really don't. And then that, you remember that and you want to pay it forward eventually. And I talk about that in my book as well, how we go through these seasons of giving, receiving, and witnessing. So, the like, the answer to everyone's problems, I don't say in the book, is just like go out and volunteer, do a random act of kindness, and you're going to feel good. Like this is the answer. Because as we know, like we have a caregiver burnout in our society.
Yeah.
People might, and caregive and volunteering and acts of kindness aren't always super accessible to everyone. So if you're in a season of giving where you can actually do this and it can feel good and you can experience the benefits I talk about, or you're in a season of receiving, or you're in a season of witnessing, which also has its benefits as well. But yeah, I mean, there are, many times in my life where just like the smallest, I remember being at a cafe once and someone like paying for my coffee or just letting me go ahead in line because I
Mm.
have a small child with me at the grocery store. So yeah.
I love that.
And that makes sense to me too, because I mean, if you are in sort of a state of like rumination or just thinking a lot or, really concentrating on the feelings in your body, um, I could see as well, especially if they're negative feelings, let's say, um, I could see how when you shift your focus from yourself to someone else, doing something for someone else, that takes the focus away from you, like what's happening with you, right? And that definitely makes sense. I think I could think about times where I myself was either like depressed or anxious and stuff like that. And one thing I really noticed is I was thinking a lot about me, what's happening with me. I didn't even think about other people, their concerns, their thoughts, their feelings. It felt like almost not I wasn't intently selfish, but people who told me what I was like during that time, I looked like I was being selfish at that time. Like I
Right.
couldn't, yeah, think about others. But then, yeah, counterintuitively, actually doing those acts of kindness also, yeah, makes you happier, takes away that focus from yourself. So that's actually really cool, like to think about it that way. Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely can shift your perspective too on, what you're experiencing. And yeah, it definitely can get you out of that negative headspace that a lot of people will find themselves in, frequently or at various points in their lives.
Yeah. And then, so you also mentioned, now going into some of the actual events themselves, you mentioned that catastrophe is often a catalyst for something like that for altruism. So you mentioned the Tubbs fire, obviously COVID-19, which is obviously a pretty prominent topic even still. So can you talk about some of those experiences?
Sure. Yeah. You mean like personally or just as it relates to my book?
Yeah, as it relates to your book, but if you have personal anecdotes, please.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So I just shared, kind of like my personal anecdote about what sparked my interest in altruism. But then fast forward that I returned to the US and I start to really notice how communities come together after some sort of crisis. So some sort of like natural disaster, like a wildfire or, and even just like looking back historically, like people really come together after a crisis. I was living in San Francisco at the time, and we had the Napa wildfires, the
Hmm.
Tubbs wildfires. And I saw how people in San Francisco, even though they weren't directly affected by what was going on in Napa and Sonoma, that everyone just kind of wanted to drop everything and donate or go and help. And people really feel really close together after some sort of crisis like that. And they're really in a way where they're kind of able to overcome their differences. And people are obviously very altruistic. So I asked, like, why it eventually fades. And there's a sociological term for this. It's called bounded solidarity. You are
Mhm.
experiencing the sense of solidarity around this crisis, but it eventually fades. And when I would ask researchers, like, why can't we sustain this? Because
Hmm.
years, even months later, people look back and they miss how connected to their communities that they felt. And I think people, usually think, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, that like after a crisis, people as a species, we would be like, I'm only focused on me surviving. And sometimes there is a little bit of that, but we need each other to survive a crisis. In your neighborhood, in your community, you need to know like who has the canned goods, who
Right.
has water, who has
Hmm.
power. And you can only know that by being connected to your community and then sharing your resources with each other so everyone can survive and be taken care of. Um, so that's where the crisis part fits into that. And I there are some ways that people have been able to sort of sustain it. And I talk about these teenagers who started volunteering in the Napa wildfire, and they were just transporting goods from like different evacuation centers, and that has basically evolved into a nonprofit that they have today called the Hero Foundation. And what was really interesting to me is to hear from these teenagers being like, it was the most, yeah, connected I felt. Like I felt part of something.
Mhm.
And it was while like people's homes were burning down, while there was just like you could barely breathe outside. Like you had to wear a mask. There was like ash falling from the sky. Like it literally felt apocalyptic to these teenagers. And yet I one of the teenagers said it was like the happiest he felt in some ways. Like, and he felt guilty kind of revealing that to me, but it was because he felt like he had a sense of purpose. And that's also a really important part of altruism is it gives people a sense of purpose. And I think that that is what we're seeking often when we are seeking like traditional self-care, the way we think of it right now, that it's like very self-focused and consumption based.
Mhm.
Yeah, and funny enough, so when you think about like, let's say Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Usually when people's basic needs aren't met, like, yeah, they fully focus on that survival mode, like literally me, that kind of thing. It'd be interesting. I wonder if like there was a way if everybody like sort of structurally, like at least thinking about that hierarchy, if they had certain needs met, that then they can actually be like systemically sort of set up to be able to think about other people. Like uh, one of the, I mean, I guess we were gonna get to this probably later, but but for example, if volunteering, let's say, was something that was mandated, right? Or at least like sort of a societal or cultural sort of expectation, I agree. I think that that would definitely help. But funny enough, I wonder if, yeah, having all of those needs met and finding a way to do that could also kind of bring about people starting to think like that naturally.
Like to be a part of it, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I talk about in my book is exploring this idea. I call it like a culture of caring,
Hmm.
where our systems are built to prioritize the act of caring and to see caring as a strength and not a weakness. And that can mean different things to different people depending on like their industry, and you know what their roles are in their communities. But and that, I mean, some researchers told me could create more of like a positive feedback loop where people
Yeah.
do feel safer, where our nervous systems aren't so on edge the whole time that we're, you know, so agitated, we are in these scarcity
Hmm.
mindset because we don't people not everyone has their basic needs taken care of in a variety of ways, and they're, you know, it's not, nothing is is free and given to you. So
Hmm.
um that can create for a society that is built on fear and scarcity. So I, you know, in part of the book, I try to explore like who's doing what to kind of change the status quo right now. And there are some people out there. So that's kind of like my little silver lining of hope in the book is to see like, oh, there are, you know, people kind of trying to prioritize caring right now.
Yeah, and we can even do this on an individual level. So as you were talking, like what I started thinking about was I started thinking about it clinically. So like, you know, for anybody in our audience who don't know, I'm a psychotherapist. And so what's so interesting is when you talk about help, like, and you again view it from a clinical framework, a lot of times when you're talking to a patient about it, so people tend to think of, not always obviously, but they tend to think of help as a weakness. So they tend to think like, oh, I don't really like giving help or I don't like receiving help, you know, kind of like you were saying before. But the interesting thing is oftentimes they have rifts in their relationships. And when you look at their relationships, you know, you're kind of wondering and you're asking yourself, and, you know, hopefully the patient, you're wondering like, well, I mean, your partner is kind of not just asking you for help. And it seems like, you know, you kind of have a sort of staunch view of it and think, you know, well, she should do, or he or whomever should do it themselves. But also the fact is that you won't receive their help. And so when we're thinking about it clinically, we're often asking the patient, we're saying, you know, what do you think it would be like for your partner if you allowed yourself to receive that help? And oftentimes people are like, oh, well, what's the big deal? It doesn't really matter. And so now, you know, as we're thinking about it in the concept and in the context of mattering, right, of being important, I think a lot of times people don't really understand that being so taking and receiving help is equivalent, or at least maybe to some extent, to actually giving help. That people often find that, yeah, they kind of struggle to understand that, like, in that help, in taking your partner's help, now all of a sudden they feel like they have a purpose, especially in the context of the relationship. They feel like they matter to you, right? They even feel like maybe they matter to the broader sphere or in the broader sphere just because now all of a sudden their aid is useful and meaningful. So maybe it could be meaningful to other people. So it's so interesting that when you're thinking about help, there's always these kind of connotations that we don't think about. As you say, like paying it forward. And it's so much, I think there's such a, what's the word? Like a deep thinking to that, right? It's like, it's not so much that you just pay it forward because you feel like you owe it to somebody, but you also pay it forward because, again, you want to matter. So again, going back to just the clinical aspect of it, why I found this super interesting is because a lot of times why our patients struggle are for the things that we don't, or they don't think about. So they don't think that, again, something as insignificant to them as like receiving help is a big deal. But I love how you paint it as a way or as a form of mattering in the world.
Yes. And yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I think it is really hard for people to also accept help. And that is part of this exchange that I'm talking about that benefits others. And I'll be honest, like I personally also really struggle with receiving help and accepting help. And it's actually something I've been thinking about a lot, you know, given where I am. I just had my second baby and I did have one woman offer to bring me over lasagna like a couple weeks ago, but
Mm.
she was also like 39 weeks pregnant. So I was like, I'm
Mm.
not gonna make I like this 39-week pregnant woman like come over, like cook lasagna for me and bring it over. I was like, oh no, like you don't have to. She's like, really, it's not a big deal. And then I pushed back again and she didn't bring it. And then I was like beating myself up about it because I'm like, you know what? She wanted to do something to connect with me
Mm-hmm.
and to kind of be friends with me and to have some sort of purpose with where she is right now. Like she, you know, is and I, yeah, I was kind of mad at myself about doing that. And I was just kind of reflecting like it is really hard to accept help sometimes. And when, like, why is it when someone offers to do something, like, you decline? Like, why, it'd be one thing too if it was, I think, maybe like my, like, cousin, or like an aunt or uncle or something, but this is someone that, like, I've only met once, so that,
Mm.
like, kind of made me feel like, I don't know, it was strange. And yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot, just about, like, when you are in kind of the season of receiving, like, it can be hard to receive. And I'll add too that this is a neighbor of mine. So, I'm like, oh, I wrote this book and I can't even receive help.
So what are your thoughts on that? If we may ask, I mean, what are your thoughts around like why people struggle with actually receiving help? I mean, because giving help is kind of more obvious, I would think, because you're thinking, well, so I'll have to spend time, have to devote
Right.
resources, etc. But yeah, why do you think it's harder for people to receive help?
I think that, it kind of touches on the research I talk about, why it's even hard to give than
Hmm.
these acts of kindness, that we get caught up in our own heads. And it's like, I created this fictional story that, like, oh, like, I'm a burden to her, even though she reached out to me. And I forgot in that moment when I declined her offer, was that, like, that is helping her too. Like, I'm giving, like, she wouldn't offer if she didn't want to. Like,
Hmm.
That's
you
true.
know? So I don't know. I think we can kind of get caught up in our own heads. And maybe I was kind of projecting too, because I was like, when I was 39 weeks pregnant, like, I didn't want to be cooking. Like,
Mm.
so, there could be some of that too. But there was so much, like, I don't know about her. And, like, you know, I don't think she would have offered um, if she hadn't wanted to. But yeah, that's just some thoughts on it.
I
It's
love it.
funny that you said projecting. That's actually something I was thinking of myself. So anytime I try to look at also myself when it comes to receiving help, I also do try to think like, okay, how would I feel if I was gonna do what, that person's offering to do? And then I
Right.
usually think, it's too much trouble. Don't worry about it. Let me save you the trip. Let me save you this. I think I'm being more considerate doing that. But then you're
Right.
right. Yeah, that is me thinking from my perspective. But I guess if I zoomed out and really thought, well, yeah, that person's offering it, right? Maybe that's something they genuinely want to do. And also, you're right. By letting somebody else give, there's that sort of reciprocal,
Yep.
or for them to give
And
and
can
for
I
the,
also add another interpretation?
sure.
So imagine this, right? So this person is 39 weeks pregnant, right? They're probably sitting at home. They're not feeling very useful. And here they have the opportunity to feel like they matter. And then
Wow.
somebody on the other end is like, oh, no, sorry.
I know. I know. I was like, jerk. It was a jerk move of me. Yeah. And I
Um,
thought I was being the considerate one, because I'm like, oh, like, she's 39 weeks pregnant. I feel
Yeah.
bad having her cook for me, and, like, to walk over here, walk up my stairs,
Hmm.
So
yeah.
yeah.
And something I found really interesting. So in the book, you talk about how altruism can physically alter your brain and improve immune function. I'm curious, actually, from the different the scientific research that's in your book, what was something that was either the most interesting to you or most surprising in your research?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's so much. I think a lot of, like, the neuroplasticity part of it, that, like, if we, I know this is, like, a very popular term right now, but, like,
Hmm.
rewire our brains, like, to be
Hmm.
more kind, to have more empathy. Um, like, it's not just physically going to benefit you, but, like, this cult, it can create maybe this culture of caring that I talk about, which maybe that's, like, a really big leap. But I mean, a lot of researchers agreed with me. And I think also just the power of altruism, the power of volunteering, even. I say that there's research from Dr. Eric Kim. He used to work at Harvard, and now he works at a university in Canada. And he's been researching this a lot on, like, the importance of purpose in the older population. And so he did a big study on how volunteering later in life was associated with fewer hospital visits and a longer lifespan. But when I first interviewed him in, like, 2017 for an article I wrote for the New York Times, he was like, but it's kind of a chicken and egg situation. Like, our healthier people more likely to volunteer? Does like the
Mm.
volunteering actually make you healthier? And, fast forward like a few years later, I asked him, like, what do you think? Like, is it still a chicken and egg situation? And he's like,
Mm.
no, like, I truly believe that volunteering, like, like make you live longer, have a longer lifespan, to have those fewer hospital visits and overall like affect your physical health, which is really interesting. And I talk more about like the neuroscience is like how volunteering and acts of kindness, specifically what's been studied is acts of kindness, how it can have like a different kind of pleasure that's lit up in your brain when it comes to the neuroscience of altruism. I mean, there's a lot that we don't know about the brain to begin with, but
Mhm.
a lot of the studies that have been done are these like imaging studies of like different parts of the brain that light up when you're like engaged in that act. And so acts of kindness light up, you know, kind of the pleasure that you experience when like you eat good food or you like buy like something nice for yourself.
Mm.
But it seems to also light up a part of the brain that's associated with like connection and community, and that can be like longer lasting. So
Wow.
it's almost like that this can be like a more durable pleasure, than kind of like just some other activities that can bring a person pleasure.
Oh, and I love that. And you
Yeah, I wanted to do a follow-up.
Oh no! Oh, so look, I'm just gonna say one quick
Sure.
thing, and then yeah. So like, this also speaks to just basic psychology with the loops. So there's obviously something called a like there's so there are two. So there's a virtuous loop, and then there's the vicious cycle, right? So the vicious cycle is a little bit more obvious. Means like the more you stay in bed, the more you stay home, the more depressed you feel. The more depressed you feel, the more likely you are to stay home, disassociate from people, etc. Right? And then the virtuous loop is essentially like even if you're feeling kind of down, in behavioral terms, behaviorism. So then behavioral terms, they would just say act as if, right? So pretend as though you're kind of happier, go outside, talk to somebody. As you talk to somebody, you start to feel a little bit better. Then you might want to go do something else. You might want to go to the store. You might want to go see a movie. You might want to call a friend, somebody you might have not spoken to. And then all of a sudden you feel better, making it more likely for you to want to do those things. And, on and on the cycle goes. So, yeah, I would say that that makes so much sense. I mean, technically speaking, we're in so much control of ourselves just in terms of what we can do for ourselves emotionally. But go ahead.
Yeah. And something I wanted to ask, I wanted to ask you, what is co-regulation and why is it vital to emotional resilience?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know if I would have like the academic definition
Oh, it
of
could be like
co-regulation.
in simple terms. Yeah.
Okay, but it's basically, yeah, like we physically like need each other's like presence to like calm our nervous systems. And I give the example, it's a personal example, like when my daughter is crying in her crib at night and like I'm really anxious. I'm like, oh my gosh, she's crying. What's she need? I'm
Mm.
up. So I'm like kind of cranky about that. But then that moment when like I hug her, we both are able to like calm down together.
Mm,
And yeah, I think that how that relates to emotional resilience. And I'll just kind of go off on a little bit of a tangent talking about emotional resilience. But I think, that's really what I'm advocating that we need to build in my book is this sort of resilience that like when we're turning to these, self-focused self-care that's being marketed to us, that's very popular right now, like in wellness culture, that's not going to
Mm.
build emotional resilience because you're still going to face all these future crises, whether societal or individual. And the way you get through them is, I think, depends on how resilient you are,
mm,
Mhm.
mentally, emotionally, and physically. So just tying that back to co-regulation, like we need each other to build resilience. You can't do it on your own.
Mm.
And I think just like realizing, yeah, that we need each other physically. After a crisis, tying it back to the crisis, like are you better off like staying at home alone, scrolling and watching the news, or connecting with friends and having people physically be around you?
Mm.
I think the latter. And
Yeah.
in my book, I interview a woman whose husband died in 9/11, and she talked about like, receiving the news and like how everyone just showed up at her house and like they were watching everything unfold on TV that day. But like what she remembers is like how everyone just wanted to help her, and like having everyone in that room with her was like so helpful. And that's what she remembers, decades later. So
Yeah, and so we live in New York, right, in Brooklyn, and yeah, when 9/11 happened, yeah, I remember everybody it was the most closest I've seen people be to each other in New York. And in New York, we every day there's always some kind of a fight or this or that or you know. But yeah, during that time, yeah, everybody it felt like everybody was just like, how should I say this? Like kind of like family in a
Mm.
way, the way that they supported each other. And then it faded, but it's funny, even though that was such a crazy time, I do sometimes when I'm talking to, let's say my friends, I'll be like, I'll reference that time, like during 9/11, I'll be like, yeah, I remember people were just really close together, like, and then we let, this politics stuff, left, right, da 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 da, all of that kind of, divide us and kind of forget that, like, you know, it's not all about that, and times like that, like during a crisis, like it showed me that it is possible for people to kind of, bond more or be more of a community. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and
Mm-hmm.
let me also just say this. So going into co-regulation, so why that to me is so interesting and why I completely agree with your perspective is sometimes when people go into therapy, so what they'll think is that so there's this pervasive myth, and I think it's very fucking American, where there's this sense like you see it pop up in pop culture all the time, where it's like you can't love people until you learn how to love yourself first, right? That is a completely nonsensical piece of advice. So I've written God knows how much about it, like that the concept of self-love doesn't really exist, that love is really for other people. And why I love what you're saying is because it really, first of all, harmonizes with what I'm saying. But why I love it so much is because it sort of speaks to a lot of what we talk about in therapy. So again, people come into therapy as though it's this individualized effort where it's like, I just have to build up enough resolve and enough determination and self-esteem. And I have to just feel like, I am lovable, right? Whatever in the world that is. So, but the way that I would kind of tweak it and what I would sort of tell or how I would sort of address it with the person is it's not so much about becoming or feeling like you're lovable. It's more like allowing yourself to accept that other people do love you, right? Which probably a lot of people already have. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So this whole notion of like I have to love myself, it just doesn't make any sense. So again, why I love this so much is because when you look at the just who we are as a people, when you look at the collective, you realize, and this is what I hope fundamentally what my therapy is for people, is that people realize that we can't really do it without other people. So if anything, what a lot of times people come into therapy for, it's like, how can you help me not need people? And I'm like, that's not really a thing. So if you're thinking like, oh, I'm just going to be able to not feel sensitive to rejection anymore, I'm just going to be able to like love myself and feel like, oh, I'm good enough. Like this is also very popularized. I am enough, these whole ideas. The thing is, these concepts are kind of not only just silly, but they're sort of useless to us. So what I would argue the point of therapy is to help sort of, and I've, said this so many times, but to weave the person back into the fabric of existence, meaning how do you become a collective part of your community, number one, and how do you address some of the paranoia that you have around being unlovable, around the fact that you think people don't value you, don't think you're important, etc. But I think that co-regulation here speaks to that so much because I think what it indicates is that we can't really do it without people. That whatever this American ideal is, it kind of leads us astray.
100%. Yeah, that makes me kind of sad that people go to therapy and are like, how can I not need other people anymore? I mean, that just, I think, speaks volumes about like, yeah, our mindset that we do have this like bootstrap culture that, we have to do everything ourselves and it's just impossible. And it just create, this vicious cycle where we're constantly almost set up for failure because you can't do it all yourself we need other people. And yet at the same time, it really is hard to be vulnerable in this society. And the act of altruism, I think, is very vulnerable.
Yeah, let me just read this. Well, I guess I'll tell you, not read it. But there's this really great quote from a psychoanalyst. Her name is Nancy McWilliams. So she said, the myth of therapy, and this is not necessarily verbatim, but she said, the myth of therapy is that it helps you cultivate independence, when in reality, what it does is it actually helps you use your dependence in a more effective way, where you can get your needs met in a way that you weren't able to before. And I love that so much because what that indicates is that not necessarily codependence, obviously, not codependence at all, but what it indicates is an interdependence, which is, I think, the healthy version of dependence.
Yeah.
And what she ultimately argues is that independence doesn't exist. Whatever you think independence is, and if you think therapy is going to do that for you, you're at the wrong place. This isn't it, man. You might want to go to some like corporate fucking seminar or something for that.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. And one of the things, so we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but you did talk about how like certain disasters, crises, you mentioned like wildfires, like different examples in the book of where these crises occurred and then people came together for it. And then after some time, that community feeling that everybody's there for each other kind of goes away. What do you think is going on there? Like, why do you think, at least from your research, that it's not sustainable, at least in those situations? Yeah.
Yeah. So one researcher, Stephen Porges, I had a lot of deep conversations with him about this, asking, and he is the one who would say, like, because all of our systems are built on fear and scarcity, and that really resonated with me because we nothing, like I said before, is given to us for free. And Alejandro Portes, who has studied, he's a sociologist, he has studied a lot bounded solidarity. When I asked him, he said straight up, like, we live in a culture of capitalism. Like, profit eventually comes first, and profit matters at the end of the day, and people need money to survive. So people have to put profit, ahead of altruism and ahead of, like, that community feeling that people experience, that bounded solidarity in the wake of a crisis. So I mean, I would agree with them. I think that is what's going on. At the same time, I don't think that people, like, want that. I think people want to stay connected and have kind of that feeling, become more durable and sustain it, after the immediate aftermath of a crisis.
Wow. Yeah, and then this is, I think, another super important part. But you mentioned when we talk about caregiver burnout, you kind of flip it on its head, right? You almost sort of argue that it's not so much caregiver burnout; it's sort of the unsustainability of the system behind it all. So let's talk about that. So this is what I'm super interested in. So first of all, why does caregiver burnout, and what are some of the systemic failures that fuel it?
Right. So caregiver burnout is when people are just completely burned out from caregiving, that they're not going to experience the emotional, mental, and physical benefits that I talk about in my book. And so the reason that we have such an epidemic of caregiver burnout is because people are forced to do it alone.
Mm.
So, that really connects back to that idea of, like, interdependence. And that comes from a researcher at UCLA, and he talks a lot about this in my book, is that, like, people are caregiving in America alone right now. They have no help, they have no support. So caregivers are so fatigued and burned out. And this ranges from, like, doctors to maybe even therapists, to people who have to take care of aging older parents,
Mhm.
to parents with, young kids. Like, we don't have universal childcare in America. We don't have, like, a lot of people can't take time off to, pay time off to take care of a sick loved one, sick a sick loved one.
Yeah.
And policies like that contribute to this caregiver burnout that we're experiencing in our society.
Yeah. Yeah. And then just like, I mean, thinking about it systemically, because I mean, not to get into this too much, but what's so interesting is, since you mentioned therapy, for a lot of like therapists who actually work in clinics, there's very little support. Like, I mean, obviously, you probably don't know much about it. You don't necessarily have to. But what's so interesting is that, like, when I talk to other therapists who do work in clinics, because like I don't, so they don't really have it. So they have extreme caseloads. The understanding is, well, kind of everybody. So maybe this is what we could get into. So, because I'm pretty sure this is like a systemic issue, wider, like a wider systemic issue as opposed to just therapy. So what happens is, like, you have a group of therapists who essentially have like these wide caseloads. So they'll see maybe 30, 50 people, some of them. And the understanding as well. So if you want support, the only real support you're getting is just the insight that we're all doing this, right? Sort of, it's like we're all in our individual silos and we all kind of just take care of our jobs, right? So do your job, right? That's kind of the
Mhm.
mentality. So if you think about it in some way, that's a little bit of that version of sort of interconnectedness, where it's like, well, we're all kind of suffering together, right? So Nicole, I wonder, what would your perspective on that be, right? So if somebody were to say, okay, well, everybody kind of has their caseloads. I understand you don't necessarily feel supported, but it's, if everybody does their job, everybody shouldn't necessarily be burned out from it.
Yeah. Well, I will say I actually do know a bit about therapy
Mm,
because my husband is a therapist.
nice.
And
Okay.
obviously, I have been in a lot of therapy, in and out myself. But I do think that, I guess my thought on that would be, like, the importance of, like, making sure that therapists have time for kind of, like, consult groups to, like, connect with each other and, like, share the details that they can about their clients, and to, like, kind of get advice, on that. But also maybe, in jobs like that, like, giving, you know, therapists more flexibility to have, like, a sliding scale. So to
Mm.
offer therapy to people who want it but can't afford it. I think that could be something else as well. But obviously, like, it is a job and people need to make, money and support their families. So maybe they can't do that. But if we live in a world where maybe you can have some sort of, a benefit or award from that, maybe even like a tax break. I don't know. I'm not a politician or policymaker, so I have no idea. But some way to like incentivize helping others, systemically would be really interesting, and I think could be kind of alleviate that burnout where like you're kind of having to just do this because it's like your job, you're kind of overwhelmed and you don't feel like you're doing it for good, maybe. Yeah, I don't know. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that because you actually work in the field. I mean, do you feel like you're helping people in your job, or do you
well, I'm sorry, just go ahead. Yeah, finish your question, please.
do you feel like you experience like the benefits I talk about in my book?
Yeah. So, okay. So, just to be fair, because I don't want to kind of paint myself in the way that sort of isn't unfair, because like I'm really talking about the clinicians, the younger ones who work for clinics.
Okay.
So, because I don't struggle the way they do. That's why I don't want to sort of paint myself and say, oh, well, I'm burned out or I'm struggling like these people. So the thing is, fortunately for me, because I have my own private practice, I could kind of set my schedule and like I could sort of tweak it whenever I need to, if I need time off, etc. So that's why it's kind of hard for me to speak from, I guess, well, current personal experience. But yeah, I can speak from my past experience as a way to kind of give them light and give them voice because I know what they're going through since I went through that. But yeah, the understanding there. So I don't like that mentality of everybody does their job, because that's first of all super unfair, because here's what happens. You tend to have people who essentially, so, and I'm sure you've seen this time and time again, where because it's so individualized, everybody's afraid and ashamed to speak about whatever problems they're having. So what happens is if everybody does their jobs, fundamentally everybody's appearing perfect, right? If you ask them, hey, have you been? I'm great. I love my work. I love my patients. Everything is going fine. So I love that you're mentioning these supervision type groups, because unless you get something like that, where you have this really deeply intimate environment, everybody's just pretending that everything is okay. So on the one hand, yeah, I get it. We're all kind of like suffering together and we all have like these big caseloads or whatever. And yes, maybe there's some community in that and just knowing like, we're all suffering or whatnot. But the point is to say what happens, unfortunately, if there isn't a deep connection with one another, you don't normally get what everybody's feeling. So just, and this is kind of the last thing I'll say about it, is why I'm so kind of keen on getting the message out for younger therapists is because so I actually had a friend of mine who, so she committed suicide because of this, or at least in part because of this, because for her caseload was severe, and so she didn't feel like she could really tell anybody. The few people that she did tell, like, they were just other therapists. I mean, there's nothing that they could do outside of offering some degree of sympathy. You can't really say much of anything. You're like, yeah, it kind of sucks, here's some things that might be helpful, here's some things that you could do for yourself, etc. But ultimately that wasn't going to change, because when she's talking to the director, the supervisor, whatever, she feels like she has to pretend that everything is okay. And that's where you get this perfectionism and caregiver burnout, essentially, where we have to kind of, again, everybody has to do their jobs. So that, I would say, is, my long-winded way of saying I wish there was a way where there could be more support, in the sense of, and I get it, cases are what they are. There's a surplus of patients. I understand that. So I don't know what the actual answers would be, but I wish there was a way for people just to be more open about it and to use one another, like we said with the Nancy McWilliams quote, more effectively to get some of those needs met, even if those needs are honestly just some sympathy across the way.
And something I still want to direct at you from Nicole's question. So, but do you find, especially with the way that you can tailor your schedule,
Yep.
which I'm guessing is suggesting you're avoiding burnout by doing that?
Yep.
Do you derive satisfaction when you are helping someone, like in the context of altruism?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Oh, that's okay. Gotcha. Okay. So that's a great question. Yeah. So I would say that my best days are when for the most part, I mean, we can't really know whether we're helping somebody, especially because a lot of these are long-term, effects, consequences. But yes, some of my best days are where people can actually tell me what specifically helped them. So usually you get this at the end of therapy, because I would do, I don't know if it's an assessment, but I would just ask, like, what did you find helpful about treatment? What was not so helpful? What would you wanted more of? What did you feel like there was not enough of? So usually I get the answers there, but once in a while somebody will say something like, hey, I thought about this thing that we talked about like 7 or 8 months ago, and this is how it actually affected me. Like, these are the changes that I made because of it. So yeah, I would argue, I would actually argue that without the component of altruism, and whatever, because I don't want to make myself seem kind of better than I am, because there's definitely a lot of selfishness in being a therapist. But the point is to say, I think without the altruistic component, like actually feeling like on an individual level that you matter to people, and that the things you say to them may not necessarily affect their personality, but at the very least can affect their thinking and maybe tweak aspects of it. Yeah, man, I don't know if there's a better feeling in the world than that. This is just me personally.
That's
Yeah,
cool.
that's awesome. That's
Yeah,
really cool.
thank you.
And something I found very interesting in the book, you talk about in Hawaii, there's, culturally, there's this something called and please correct me if I say it wrong, the Malama mindset. Can you
Mhm.
talk about what that is? And also, do you think that because that exists out there, like this kind of way well, sorry, do you think that that could exist elsewhere, not just like in Hawaii? Like we can do something like that and replicate that in other places. Yeah.
Mhm. Right. So in my book and my search for figuring out like who's trying to make volunteering more accessible, right now, I came across the volunteerism program in Hawaii called, I think it's called like the Malama program. And basically, the idea is to incentivize tourists to volunteer while they're on vacation in Hawaii. And I thought this was really interesting, just the contrast between like a very like hedonistic vacation where people
Yeah.
have obviously like saved a lot of money. They're looking forward to this. Like they're splurging. People sometimes just go to Hawaii like once in their lifetime.
Mhm.
Um, and asking people to volunteer their time while on vacation. And so the idea of this actually came because the director of tourism in Hawaii, who I interviewed in my book, he called it like a 1 year listening tour, asking locals like, how can we make this this over tourism better for you, because it really has become a problem in the state. And they were like, well, so many people are coming, like we're having all these extra hands, like how can their experience be less extractive and how can they like give back a little.
Mhm.
So basically, it's just like different like nonprofits who want to participate in this program, and like the ways that tourists are incentivized are varies. So maybe they get like a discount on their hotel for a night or like a free meal. It all varies. But the name of it, Malama, comes from this idea that like we are all like stewards of this world, and it's really, yeah, I call it the Malama mindset, that just like walking this earth and knowing like your purpose is to take care of it, to take care of the people around you, I think is another way that you can experience the benefits of altruism that I talk about. And so, I think that's important because I think people think like, oh, I have to do a physical act of kindness, I have to volunteer regularly. But I wanted to also point out that just a mindset shift, that like your existence matters, that your vitality matters, and that comes from another nonprofit in Oakland, Open Source Wellness, that I interview and participate in. But just like your presence matters and you're a steward of this world. And I thought that was just really beautiful, and, kind of a cool like mindset shift in a way that you can experience altruism as well.
Yeah, and then go.
And oh, I just wanted to ask if you think that that we could replicate that in maybe other states. Like, do you think that's like something from having witnessed it and having talked about it, that that's something that's achievable in other places? Because that would be cool, right? Like, honestly, if more people could be incentivized, let's say for volunteering, and kind of make that like a staple of this or that state or how whatever country. I mean, that could have really sizable ripple effects as
Yeah.
far as that goes. So
I mean, I
yeah.
think so. I think obviously like Hawaii is very unique, and a lot of, that having that Malama mindset, I'm not an expert on it, but I mean, it's very like deeply rooted in their culture. But yeah, I mean, that was my biggest takeaway, is just like, how can we walk this earth where we're, really seeing ourselves as these like stewards of kindness, of these stewards of just taking care of each other, taking care of this earth. And like, that's your purpose on this earth. Like your purpose doesn't have to be like your job or something else that you're, working on. It can just be like being you and just like having that mindset and acting on it when you can every day.
I love that. And yeah, and we can kind of debate around sort of the objectivity or subjectivity of purpose, but I think it's super telling going back into some of the mental health stuff. And, you mentioned some of the research, but I think it's super telling that when you talk to somebody who's depressed, I mean, it's not all the time that this comes up, but a major theme that comes up, and the major, it's, and I quote this verbatim, but a major sort of idea, concept, whatever that comes up is, I don't make anybody happy. I don't do anything that brings anybody joy. Right. And so, I mean, you can again debate about, like, some of these might be religious ideas. Obviously, a lot of us have religious backgrounds. We're part of a sort of community that in some cases, in many ways, like inculcates these ideas in us that, like, you have to matter to people, whatever. But what I'm saying is that it's sort of interesting that you see this theme come up periodically with people where I would say it's persistent enough for it to matter, no pun intended, is that every single time or most of the time when somebody's depressed, they frequently say things like, I don't do anything that makes other people happy. So you would think that most people would say, like, oh, I feel like shit about myself. Let's say I'm not attractive enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm not successful enough. And of course, these things obviously persistently come up. But I would say the number one thing, when you really ask people, like, what do you think makes you depressed? I would say at the top of the list, it's like you don't even have to do much digging most of the time. You just ask them, like, hey, what is it about your life that you feel like you're missing? One of the main things that people say is, I don't do anything that brings anybody joy. And it's like, wow, man, that really indicates how much community matters. Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. How do you get people out of that place? Like, do you prescribe volunteering or acts of kindness or community at all?
So great question. Okay, so I try my best not to prescribe much of anything nor give necessarily advice, right? But first, this is what I would do. So because I'm a very CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy oriented therapist, so the first question I'll ask is it actually true, right? Is it actually true that you don't bring anybody joy? Is it actually true that you don't matter? And then we might look at the ways that people have actually mattered to other people in the past, and we might try to exaggerate them. Not exaggerate them cognitively, I mean exaggerate them kind of in the world, right? Sort of amplify them rather. So they would kind of go out, try to redo those things. So remember, like we talked about acting as if. So fundamentally, you would go off into the world and sort of pretend that you're happier, or pretend in some ways that, like, what you're going to do is going to matter. And then oftentimes what happens is people see that they actually do matter and have mattered. Sometimes it's even talking to your, let's say, in your case would be your husband, whomever it is, but saying, okay, I really believe this about myself, that I don't bring anybody joy, that I don't matter. And people say, what are you talking about? That is 100% not true. And so a lot of times people learn that it's depression talking rather than anything else. So I'm really hesitant to give people prescriptions, even though I could definitely see the benefit of that. But it's more like asking yourself, hey, how true is this? What's actually worked for you in the past? Do you think you want to try some of these things again? But the point is to say why I love this in your approach so much is because you can again see, just naturally speaking, this is pretty much the point I'm getting to. Naturally speaking, it seems like fundamentally for us as human beings, we really feel like we need to matter to other people. And even if it's not true, it's just kind of interesting how depression works, where it sort of warps your mind into thinking not only are you just, again, not successful, attractive, whatever, but also that you're not important in the local or in the even broader community. So again, it so speaks to your work about how much this stuff just I think innately matters to people.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I have a chapter called Why Mattering Matters.
Oh,
So
do tell. Do tell.
It's just a whole chapter about that. And where I go on UCLA's campus and visit the former director of Belonging. And she was brought on because the students at UCLA, I guess, were experiencing, like, they didn't measure, and they don't measure, as far as I know, based on my research up until, my research stopped in like 2023. So maybe they are measuring loneliness now, but before they were measuring like a sense of belonging on campus, and found that like a lot of the students didn't feel like they had the sense of belonging to the campus, to the community, like to the student body. And they brought this woman, Kat Moore, on board to be the director of Belonging. And she is like an expert in loneliness. And she came up with this curriculum, CLICK. And it's an acronym for, I would have to look back at my notes.
Okay, what's that? I'll look it up for you. What does it CLICK and what's her name?
CLICK, Kat Moore.
Gotcha.
Communicate. I can't. Sorry.
No, it's okay. You can keep talking. I'll let you know what it is.
But one of the pillars of it is to basically like communicate and kindness. And she said something that's in my book that really resonated with me. Like, it's one thing to have a connection with someone and be connecting with someone. It's another thing to be connecting with someone and actually feel like they care about you and you care about them. And like, we need that kindness in our connections, in our lives. Like,
Mm.
and when that's missing, that's really like, when you're in a crisis, then you don't feel like you can go to that so-called friend and say like, hey, I need help. And, I'm in this bind, or I'm really feeling down. Like, you can't do that if you haven't built that connection that also is like includes and incorporates kindness and caring for each other.
I love it. So here's what it stands for: connecting, listening, investigation, communicating, and kindness.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And then and also the K is for keeping in touch as well. That's cool.
Keeping in touch. Yeah. So it's communicating and kindness and keeping in touch. Yeah. So, yeah, that's kind of where I feature like the importance of mattering. And she was doing like these random acts of belonging on campus, like just giving out flowers as like a way to
Mm.
connect with people. And there was like one moment where a student like started crying. It was like, you have no idea like what this means to me. I've been having such a hard day. Like, had she not been there and connected with her on that level, like, she would have gone on to probably have a horrible day and go on with her crisis. But she had that moment where on campus, someone gave her something, a free flower, and
Mm.
that's how they connected. And it was like, gave her
Mm.
a moment to be vulnerable with her and to kind of, share that she was struggling. And I'm sure she like still remembers that, which I think is really cool and powerful.
Wow. So then I would ask, in your kind of understanding of all this or your assessment, like how much do you think we actually just on average undervalue that, like these small acts of kindness? Like how often do you think we go, to ourselves or to other people, oh, that probably won't make a difference, or oh, that probably just didn't matter?
Yeah, well, that goes kind of back to Amit Kumar's research that I talk about in the book. And basically, he's like, he's famous. He's been on like NPR's like Hidden Brain,
Mm.
and he's talked about this. And so I interviewed him for the book. And basically, he thinks that like we don't do these random acts of kindness because we underestimate the impact it's going to have. But in his research, he did the study where people were like giving out free hot chocolate to people in Chicago, like on a really cold day. And yeah, that's what he found true. So basically, like he's, explains in my book that we get in our own way, but like actually it really matters to other people. Like then he measured like kind of the happiness and impact of the people who received the hot chocolate, and like they were
Mm.
so happy, it made their day, like they had, and it's just
Mm.
like a cup of hot chocolate. And then
Yeah.
the giver was thinking like, it's not even going to matter. Like it's not even going to make like this person's going to think it's weird. So I think that's really interesting, just thinking like we get caught up in our own heads and we're getting in our own way of doing these like random acts of kindness. And I think also because it does require like a certain level of vulnerability to like give a flower to a stranger or
Hmm.
just do
Sure.
something
Yeah.
nice for someone that you don't know. So it can feel really, really scary. But I think that's, kind of where the difference is between just like, let's say you're feeling really lonely and anxious and like, yeah, you can go connect with, go to like some sort of like social outing or like go do some sort of hobby where you're
Mhm.
kind of like in a parallel play state, or like where you do a random act of kindness and you're actually connecting with someone like really vulnerably, making their day, and you're experiencing these benefits as well.
Yeah. Wow. All right. So, and yeah, let me just say one more thing before we start wrapping up.
Absolutely.
What's so interesting also about that is I think the person in their own mind, they're thinking like, if I'm vulnerable and I give, let's say, this person a flower, I think there's a sense of, oh, I'm going to feel ashamed of myself for thinking that I would matter to that person that much. And yeah, I think, yeah, for a lot of people, it's so hard for them to put themselves out there. But again, why I like this sort of research is because it kind of indicates that these people are looking for that. Like all of us want that. We're looking for people to do random things for us. And yeah, again, if the more you devalue it, the worse, obviously the worse it is, but then also the less and less frequently these things happen. So
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
All right, Alan, final questions for Nicole before we wrap up?
Absolutely. Yeah. If we wanted to follow you, follow your work, and of course buy the book, where can we do that?
Yeah, so my book, Your Brain on Altruism, is available at bookshop.org, your local bookstore, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and I'm on Instagram. I don't post that much, but at Nicole
Yeah.
Karlis, and my website is NicoleMKarlis.com.
Excellent,
Awesome.
Nicole. Thank you
This
so
was
much. This
awesome.
was so
Yeah.
insightful.
Thank you. This was really fun. I really enjoyed speaking with you both. Thank you for having
Absolutely.
me.
You're very welcome. We'll talk to you soon.
Everyone, if you'd like to follow us, you could follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. On X, we're at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe,
Hit
hit
the
the
bell
bell
on
on
YouTube.
YouTube. And again, thank you so much for watching and see you next time.